I was standing at my living room window with a cup of coffee watching a tactical SWAT unit in full gear surround my grandfather's rotting house at 6:47 in the morning, and I knew exactly what was about to happen next because Brenda had just broken in through the back window with a rolling suitcase, thinking she was about to claim squatters' rights on free real estate. Except she had absolutely no idea I had legally donated that condemned property to the police department for live breaching drills exactly 3 days earlier. The flashbang went off at 6:51, and I swear to you, I have never heard a human being scream that loud in my entire life. 8 weeks of her parking in my driveway, trespassing, throwing garbage on the lawn, waving fake leases printed in Comic Sans. All of it collapsed in one beautiful, chaotic second when 6 heavily armed officers mistook her for an armed intruder and treated her exactly like one. My name is Marcus. I am 41. I work a boring office job in a violently average suburban neighborhood where the most exciting thing that ever happens is Susan leaving passive-aggressive notes about trash cans. And before I tell you how Brenda ended up in the back of a police cruiser covered in drywall dust and shame, I need you to understand exactly how spectacularly stupid you have to be to break into a house while a tactical team is literally pulling up to the curb. Have you ever met someone so intensely entitled that their sheer existence seems to defy the laws of physics? Like, they somehow manage to suck the oxygen out of an entire room just by walking into it. You know exactly the type of person I'm talking about. They usually wear clothes that cost way too much money, but somehow still look incredibly cheap, and they walk around with this permanent scowl like the rest of humanity is a bad smell they cannot escape. Everyone knows this type of person, but I need to tell you about the absolute pinnacle of this terrible species. Her name was Brenda. I say was not because she is deceased, but because her dignity certainly is, and I had the absolute, undeniable pleasure of securing front-row tickets to its funeral. This is the story of how an aggressively confident squatter tried to steal a supposedly abandoned house, completely unaware that I had legally signed the property over to the local police department for active tactical breaching drills. Let me just set the scene for you, because you really need to understand the agonizing level of delusion we are dealing with here. I live in a violently average suburban neighborhood. We have perfectly manicured lawns, incredibly passive-aggressive neighborhood watch meetings, and exactly 0 exciting things happening at any given time, ever. It is the kind of place where a slightly loud lawnmower at 7 in the morning on a Sunday is considered a major local scandal. If you leave your trash cans out on the curb for 12 hours after the garbage truck comes by, you are definitely getting a highly laminated, strongly worded note taped to your front door by Susan, the neighborhood watch president. My grandfather had lived right next door to me for 30 years in this sleepy little bubble. He was a genuinely great guy, but he was also the kind of guy who thought saving old glass jars of rusty screws was a legitimate long-term retirement plan. He hoarded the strangest things. We are talking thousands of plastic grocery bags shoved inside other plastic grocery bags, stacks of nature magazines from the 1980s, and an absurd collection of terrifying ceramic frogs that stared at you from every corner of the living room. When he passed away, I inherited his house. I did not want this house. I loved my grandfather, but the place was a complete structural disaster. We are talking lime green shag carpet from the 1970s that had been compressed into a solid, unyielding mat of despair. The wallpaper was aggressively floral and was peeling off in huge chunks, revealing drywall that smelled vaguely of boiled cabbage and old shoes. The foundation was shifting so terribly that you could literally drop a marble in the kitchen and watch it pick up speed as it rolled all the way into the living room, eventually hitting the baseboard with a loud thud. Fixing the place up to a livable standard would have cost me over $90,000. Selling it as a tear-down property would have barely covered the ridiculous closing costs and the real estate agent fees. The house was essentially a useless, rotting wooden box taking up space. But Brenda did not see a rotting wooden box. Brenda saw a golden opportunity for completely free real estate. Brenda lived a few streets over, but she treated the entire zip code like it was her personal feudal kingdom. She drove this massive, pristine, white luxury sport utility vehicle that she absolutely, categorically did not know how to drive. You know the exact vehicle I'm talking about. It is roughly the size of a military personnel carrier, gets about 4 miles to the gallon, and never has a single speck of dirt or mud on its giant chrome wheels. She would constantly park it half on the sidewalk and half on the street, completely blocking the path for anyone walking their dogs or pushing a stroller. If you politely asked her to move it, she would hit you with this high-pitched, incredibly nasal laugh that sounded exactly like a seagull choking on a stale French fry. She had this infuriating way of looking at you over the rim of her glasses like you were something highly infectious that she had just scraped off the bottom of her designer shoe. Her aesthetic was purely lawsuit pending. She wore these giant, hideous designer knockoff sunglasses, rain or shine, even indoors, which made her look like a highly arrogant bug. She paired them with cheap leopard print leggings and neon pink sweatshirts. She walked around with a constantly pursed lip, rapidly tapping her neon yellow acrylic fingernails on her extremely expensive smartphone. I hated her immediately. Everyone in the neighborhood did. Gary, the guy across the street who obsessively edges his lawn 3 times a week, once saw her throw an empty iced coffee plastic cup straight into his flower bed. When Gary yelled at her, she literally told him that her taxes pay his salary. Gary is a retired plumber. That statement makes absolutely 0 sense. But my casual, everyday hatred for this woman crystallized into something pure, bright, and beautiful when she set her greedy little sights on my grandfather's empty house. It started small, as these things always do. I noticed her massive white tank parked right in my grandfather's cracked concrete driveway one Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting on my front porch, drinking an iced tea, minding my own business. I figured maybe she was just using the driveway to turn around, even though she is a terrible driver, and it took her 5 minutes of reversing and pulling forward to maneuver the beast. But she did not pull away. Instead, she put the vehicle in park, turned off the engine, and stepped out. She marched right up to the front windows of the rotting house, cupped her hands around her bug eyes to block the afternoon glare, and pressed her face against the dirty glass. I walked over, trying to keep my blood pressure at a normal human level, and asked if I could help her find something. She did not even flinch or look embarrassed. She just turned to me, gave me that sickening fake smile, and said she was just admiring the classic architecture. Architecture? I looked at the collapsing ranch-style home with rotting wood siding and sagging gutters. I told her the house was private property and firmly asked her to leave. She scoffed loudly, literally threw her hand up in a highly dismissive wave, and sauntered back to her giant car, her neon yellow nails clicking against the door handle. A few days later, the real test of boundaries began. I found a pile of empty fast food bags and another iced coffee cup tossed onto the front lawn of the empty house. Then, she started parking her car in the driveway overnight. Every single time I confronted her about it, she escalated her ridiculous excuses. First, she told me she was just resting her eyes because she had a headache. Then, she claimed she was actually doing the neighborhood a massive favor by keeping an eye out for potential vandals. It was insulting to my basic human intelligence. I am not an idiot, and I could practically hear the rusty gears turning in her head. She had realized the house was completely empty. She knew through the neighborhood gossip vine that my grandfather had passed away. She was testing the waters to see exactly how much she could get away with before someone physically stopped her. She was mapping out her hostile takeover. Now, I am not a super confrontational guy by nature. I do not want to be an action hero. I just want to drink my morning coffee, go to my terribly boring office job, come home, and not deal with absolute human garbage. But Brenda was pushing me to a very dark, petty place. I seriously considered calling a local tow truck company to drag her car away. But then I had a much, much better idea. I remembered a conversation I had about a month prior with a good buddy of mine named Dave. Dave works as a dispatcher for the county police department. We play poker every other Thursday night in my garage. Over a couple of cheap beers, he had mentioned that the local tactical response team, the heavily armed special weapons and tactics guys who deal with the really bad high-risk situations, were always completely desperate for real, physical houses to practice in. Dave told me they usually have to train in these fake, flimsy plywood mock-ups out behind the police station, which gets incredibly boring and predictable for them. They desperately need real, heavy wooden doors to physically kick down. They need real glass windows to break. They need completely unfamiliar floor plans to clear so they can practice their communication. So, the very next morning, I made a phone call. I asked Dave to connect me with the guy in charge of the training exercises. He gave me the number for a lieutenant named Miller. I called Miller, introduced myself, and explained the exact situation with the house. I told him how it was a total loss, how it needed to be demolished anyway, and asked if they wanted to use it as a playground for a few weeks. Lieutenant Miller sounded like a little kid who had just woken up on his birthday and found a pony in the living room. He drove out to my house the exact same afternoon. He was a big, intimidating guy with a shaved head and a handshake that could crush a rock. He walked through the cabbage-smelling rooms, stepping over the water-damaged floorboards, and immediately drew up a standard civilian liability release form on the hood of his cruiser. I signed the property over for a strictly designated 2-week training period. They had absolute, unrestricted free rein to destroy the entire interior of the structure. They could blow the hinges off the bedroom doors, smash through the awful drywall, toss practice grenades, do literally whatever they needed to practice their barricaded suspect drills. The absolute best part of this entire arrangement? Miller scheduled their first massive, full-team exercise for a Friday morning, specifically the very next Friday. While I was busy setting up this glorious, invisible trap, Brenda was incredibly busy plotting her own hostile takeover. The weekend right before the scheduled police raid, I saw her walking proudly up the driveway. She was holding a clipboard, a literal clipboard, like she was some kind of official city building inspector or a wealthy real estate developer. I walked straight out of my front door and intercepted her before her leopard print leggings could even reach the porch steps. I planted myself on the concrete and asked her exactly what she thought she was doing on my property. She puffed out her chest, aggressively adjusted those stupid, oversized bug sunglasses, and hit me with the most baffling, poorly constructed lie I have ever heard in my 30-odd years of life. She claimed with a completely straight face that she had signed a legally binding lease for the property. I just stared at her. I was completely dumbfounded. My brain actually stopped working for about 10 seconds. I asked her who exactly she signed a lease with, considering I was the sole legal owner of the property, and I had the deed sitting in a fireproof safe in my bedroom closet. She gave me that horrible choking seagull laugh again. She rolled her eyes and said she found the property management company online and wired them her first and last month of rent plus a security deposit. She pulled a piece of crumpled, poorly printed paper off her cheap plastic clipboard and forcefully shoved it toward my chest. I did not even need to read the fine print to know it was completely fabricated. The entire document was printed in Comic Sans font. There was absolutely no corporate letterhead. The margins were totally crooked, and I am 99% sure she misspelled the actual name of our street. It was the laziest, most pathetic forgery in the entire history of human deception. I handed the paper back to her, trying very hard not to smile. I told her the lease was obviously fake. I told her I owned the house. There was no mysterious property management company. And if she stepped one single foot inside that structure, she would be officially trespassing on private property. Her face immediately turned a shade of dark crimson that usually indicates an impending medical emergency. Thick, blue veins literally popped out on her neck. She started screaming. She was not just talking loudly, she was full-on screeching at the absolute top of her lungs, causing Gary across the street to stop his leaf blower and stare. She told me I was a pathetic liar. She told me she knew her legal rights, which makes absolutely zero sense, and then she finally dropped the magic words. She said she had squatter's rights. There it was, the ultimate delusion. She had clearly watched one too many internet videos made by people stealing empty vacation homes and genuinely thought she had found the ultimate real estate loophole. She pointed a bright yellow manicured finger about 1 single inch from the tip of my nose and loudly declared that she was officially moving her things in on Friday morning, and there was absolutely nothing I or anyone else could do to stop her. She said the state law was completely on her side, and if I tried to interfere with her move-in day, she would personally call the local authorities and have me arrested for criminal harassment. The sheer irony of her threatening to call the police on me was so thick you could have cut it with a literal chainsaw. I just smiled. It was probably a very terrifying, unsettling smile, honestly, because my hands were shaking and I was vibrating with a chaotic mix of pure, unadulterated rage and euphoric anticipation. I told her okay. I told her to go ahead and move in on Friday. I even took a step back, gestured toward the house, and told her she should probably use the back door because the front lock was rusty and prone to jamming. I backed away slowly, wished her a genuinely wonderful day, and went back inside my house to mark my kitchen calendar with a bright red marker. The next 4 days were pure psychological agony. Have you ever known a secret so incredibly good that it physically hurts your chest to keep it inside? I felt like a comic book supervillain sitting in my suburban lair, just obsessively watching the clock tick down minute by agonizing minute. I could barely sleep at night. I kept pacing around my living room in the dark, peeking out through my window blinds at the dark, empty house next door. I was terrified she would suddenly change her mind. I was absolutely paranoid that she would decide to break in on Wednesday night instead and completely ruin the comedic timing of my trap. Every single time a car drove past my house after midnight, my heart jumped straight up into my throat. But Brenda, operating in her state of infinite cosmic arrogance, stuck strictly to her own imaginary schedule. On Thursday evening, right as the sun was setting, I saw her creeping around the side of the house, peering over the wooden fence into the overgrown backyard. She was physically scoping out the back door, exactly like I had so helpfully suggested. She was really, truly going to do it. She genuinely believed that if she just broke in, set down a cheap inflatable air mattress, and ordered a pizza to the address, the entire American legal system would magically protect her and hand her a highly valuable piece of property for absolutely free. The level of entitlement was staggering. It honestly made me a little sick to my stomach, but it also guaranteed that the impending justice would taste incredibly sweet. Friday morning finally arrived. The air was crisp, the sun was shining brightly, and the birds were chirping. I was wide awake at exactly 5 a.m, brewing the strongest, darkest pot of coffee I could possibly make. I dragged a comfortable foldable lawn chair right up to the absolute edge of my property line, positioning it perfectly in the gap between my house and the empty house. I had a completely unobstructed, perfect view of the entire backyard and the rotting wooden back door. I sat down, wrapped both hands around my warm ceramic mug, and waited in the chilly morning air. At exactly 6:45 in the morning, the pristine white luxury vehicle slowly rolled down the street. It hopped the curb and parked perfectly illegally, completely blocking the sidewalk in front of my grandfather's house. Out stepped Brenda. She was wearing her signature cheap leopard print leggings and a bright, blindingly pink sweatshirt. She had a massive, hard-shell rolling suitcase in her right hand and a large plastic grocery bag full of what looked like paper towels and spray cleaners in her left hand. She looked around shiftily, her head darting back and forth, completely ignoring the hilarious fact that I was sitting exactly 20 feet away in a lawn chair, staring directly at her soul. She waddled her way up the cracked concrete driveway, dragging the heavy suitcase whose tiny plastic wheels made a terrible scraping sound against the pavement. She disappeared through the side wooden gate and entered the backyard. I quietly stood up from my chair and moved a few steps closer to the chain-link fence to watch the main event. Brenda marched right up to the heavy, solid wood back door. She jiggled the brass handle. It was locked, obviously. She huffed loudly in visible annoyance, dropped her heavy bags onto the dead grass, and looked around the yard. She actually bent down, picked up a heavy, decorative red brick from the neglected garden bed, and smashed it directly against the small glass window pane right next to the door handle. The ancient glass shattered with a surprisingly loud crash, sending sharp fragments scattering across the kitchen linoleum inside. She reached her arm carefully through the jagged hole, unlocked the deadbolt from the inside, and pushed the heavy door open. She had officially, undeniably committed felony breaking and entering. She grabbed her rolling suitcase, strutted confidently inside the dark kitchen, and slammed the door shut behind her. I looked down at my wristwatch. It was exactly 6:55 in the morning. Lieutenant Miller had specifically told me the tactical response team would arrive at exactly 7:00 sharp. The timing was so incredibly perfect, so flawlessly executed by the universe, that I briefly wondered if I was trapped in an elaborate dream. I practically jogged back to my lawn chair, sat down heavily, and took a massive, burning sip of my dark roast coffee. 5 minutes left until the fireworks. At precisely 6:58, the low rumble started. It sounded exactly like a minor earthquake slowly rolling through the peaceful suburban streets. I looked down the road and saw the cavalry arriving. It was not just one regular police cruiser, it was an entire tactical convoy. There were 3 massive, unmarked black utility vehicles, followed closely by a gigantic, terrifying armored personnel carrier that looked like it belonged on a literal battlefield. It was painted flat matte olive green, had heavy steel plating bolted all over it, and had tiny little slit windows. They rolled down the street with absolute, terrifying precision and completely blocked off both lanes of the road. Susan, the neighborhood watch president, threw open her front door in her pink bathrobe, her jaw practically hitting the floor. The heavy steel doors of the black utility vehicles swung open simultaneously, and outpoured at least 15 highly trained officers in full, heavy tactical gear. We are talking thick olive green Kevlar vests, heavy ballistic helmets with dark face visors, hard plastic knee pads, and matte black assault rifles slung securely across their chests. They moved completely silently, communicating strictly with sharp hand signals. Lieutenant Miller was leading the charge at the front of the pack. I caught his eye and gave him a very subtle, respectful nod from my lawn chair. He did not wave back because he was deeply in the zone in full professional mode, but I distinctly saw the corner of his eye crinkle in acknowledgement. The officers thought they were hitting a completely empty, abandoned structure to practice a highly dangerous, high-risk entry. They had absolutely no idea there was an extremely angry, highly entitled woman wearing leopard print leggings currently trying to sweep up broken window glass in the kitchen. The tactical team immediately split into 2 highly organized groups. One group moved rapidly but silently toward the front door, carrying a massive, heavy steel battering ram that looked incredibly heavy. The second group, led personally by Miller, flanked rapidly around the side of the house, moving through the gate toward the backyard. I practically held my breath. My heart was hammering violently against my ribs. I wanted to scream out loud with pure joy. I desperately wanted to pull my phone out of my pocket and film the entire thing, but I knew if I made any sudden movements, they might yell at me to go back inside my house for safety, and I absolutely refused to miss a single millisecond of this magnificent event with my own 2 eyes. The officers in the backyard, stacked up tightly against the exterior wall, right next to the exact door Brenda had just smashed and broken through. Miller silently crept forward and peeked through the freshly shattered window pane. I saw his entire posture change in a fraction of a second. His body completely froze. He rapidly pulled his hand back and made a sharp, aggressive closed fist gesture in the air. The entire stacked team of officers stopped dead in their tracks, perfectly still. Miller immediately tapped his radio earpiece. I could not hear what he was whispering into his microphone, but I knew exactly what was happening inside his brain. He saw her. He saw a living, breathing human being moving around inside the house that was legally supposed to be completely empty. In one single instant, the entire atmosphere of the morning violently shifted. This was no longer a routine, boring training drill. In their minds, this had suddenly become a real-life, highly dangerous barricaded suspect scenario. The officers immediately unslung their weapons, bringing the heavy rifles up tightly to their shoulders. The guy standing by the front door with the massive steel battering ram adjusted his grip, bracing his legs against the concrete porch. They fully believed they had a real intruder, possibly heavily armed, hiding in a structure they were actively about to aggressively breach. Miller quickly signaled to the large officer standing directly behind him. That officer reached down to his tactical belt, unhooked a small latch, and pulled out a thick, heavy, cylindrical object. A flashbang, a literal, military-grade sensory stun grenade. My eyes went so wide they actually hurt. I squeezed the plastic armrests of my folding lawn chair so hard my knuckles turned completely white. Oh my goodness, they were actually going to throw a live stun grenade into the kitchen. Miller held up 3 gloved fingers. Then he dropped 1 finger to make it 2. Then 1. He pointed aggressively at the back door. The lead officer stepped forward and violently kicked the heavy wooden door completely wide open. It slammed against the interior wall with a massive crack. The officer holding the cylinder casually tossed it inside, bouncing it off the linoleum floor. There was exactly a 1-second pause. The silence was agonizing. Then, the absolute loudest noise I have ever heard in my entire 30 years of life violently erupted from the small kitchen. Bang! The concussive sound physically hit me directly in the center of my chest. It felt like someone hit me with a mattress. A brilliant, blinding flash of pure white light illuminated the dark, cabbage-smelling interior of the house. This was immediately followed by a massive, thick plume of pale gray smoke violently billowing out of the open back door and into the morning air. And then came the scream. It was not a normal human scream. It was the horrific primal sound of a human soul forcibly leaving the physical body in pure, unadulterated terror. It was a high-pitched, vibrating, endless shriek that easily cut through the intense ringing in my ears. The officers flooded into the house like a highly trained swarm of very angry, heavily armed bees. "Police, get down on the ground! Show me your hands now!" The deep, booming shouts from the officers were deafening. They were incredibly aggressive, highly trained voices specifically meant to demand absolute, immediate physical compliance from dangerous criminals. I immediately leaped out of my lawn chair, spilling hot, dark roast coffee all over my shoes, and sprinted the short distance to the chain-link fence, completely desperate to see the action inside. Through the wide-open back door and the slowly clearing gray smoke, I saw the absolute most beautiful portrait of poetic justice ever painted in human history. Brenda was lying completely flat on her stomach on the dirty, peeling linoleum floor. Her ridiculous oversized bug sunglasses were knocked completely askew, dangling precariously off her left ear. Her bright pink sweatshirt was completely covered in white drywall dust and gray soot. 3 massive tactical officers were kneeling heavily around her. One incredibly large officer had his thick knee planted firmly and securely squarely on her lower back, pinning her to the floor. Another officer was forcefully but efficiently pulling her flailing arms behind her back and securing her wrists tight with thick, heavy-duty plastic zip ties. She was coughing violently from the thick chemical smoke, crying huge tears that smeared her makeup, and thrashing her legs wildly like a toddler throwing a massive tantrum in the middle of a grocery store candy aisle. "I have a lease! I have a lease!" She wailed hysterically, her raspy voice cracking loudly in absolute panic. "I am a legal tenant! You cannot do this to me! I know my rights!" The large officer who was currently securing her zip tied hands, did not care at all about her rights. He just aggressively barked back, "Stop resisting right now! Do not move a muscle!" They forcefully grabbed her by the arms and dragged her up to her feet. Her face was an absolute disaster of smeared mascara, black soot, and endless tears. She looked completely, utterly miserable. They physically walked her out the back door, frog marching her right past the exact spot where she had so confidently smashed the window brick just 15 short minutes earlier. As the officers hauled her roughly toward the front yard, she finally turned her head and caught sight of me. I was comfortably leaning against my chain-link fence, still holding my half-empty ceramic coffee mug, beaming a smile so wide it actually made my cheeks hurt. Her eyes locked directly onto mine, and the sheer, undiluted venom in her dark stare could have easily melted solid steel beams. "You!" she screeched at the absolute top of her ruined lungs, struggling pointlessly against the firm grip of the two massive officers holding her arms. "You set me up. You told me to come in the back door. He told me to do it. Arrest him!" I did not break eye contact. I just raised my mug, took a very slow, highly deliberate sip of my slightly cold coffee, and gave her a very small, incredibly polite wave. "Have a wonderful first day in your brand new house, Brenda," I said, loudly enough for her to easily hear my voice over the loud, idling diesel engine of the massive armored vehicle parked in the street. Lieutenant Miller slowly walked over to my side of the fence, pulling his heavy ballistic helmet off his sweaty head. He was wiping thick drops of sweat from his forehead with the back of his tactical glove, looking completely and utterly bewildered by the entire situation. "Hey," Miller said, breathing quite heavily from the massive adrenaline dump. "Do you happen to know that crazy woman? Because she is currently screaming at my guys claiming she legally rented this exact place from you." I started laughing. Not a fake, high-pitched seagull laugh, but a deep, genuine, rumbling laugh that came straight from the bottom of my soul. I took a deep breath and happily explained the entire glorious situation to Miller. I told him all about the giant white vehicle blocking the sidewalk, the constant warnings about trespassing, the laughably fake lease document printed entirely in Comic Sans, and her brilliantly stupid master plan to claim legal squatters' rights on a condemned property. I carefully explained that she had violently broken in through the back window exactly 5 minutes before his heavily armed convoy rolled down the street. Miller just stared at me for a very long, quiet moment. He looked back at the house, then back at me. Then a massive, brilliant grin slowly spread completely across his face. He shook his head slowly from side to side in pure disbelief. "Buddy," Miller said, chuckling deeply, "you really could have warned us about her. My guys genuinely thought we had a heavily armed sovereign citizen making a violent last stand in the kitchen. My point man almost had a massive heart attack when he saw her moving through the glass." I profusely apologized, telling him honestly that I genuinely, truly thought she would completely chicken out at the very last possible second. I did not actually think she had the sheer nerve to break a window. Miller waved his hand dismissively, telling me not to worry about it. He told me it was actually absolutely fantastic training for his younger guys. He said they very rarely get a live suspect who screams quite that loudly or throws such an entertaining temper tantrum after a flashbang goes off. I stood comfortably at my fence and happily watched as 2 officers practically carried Brenda and loaded her forcefully into the cramped back seat of a standard black and white patrol car that had quickly pulled up directly behind the giant armored vehicle. Her massive, hard-shell rolling suitcase and her cheap plastic grocery bag full of surface cleaners were carelessly tossed onto the concrete curb to be logged as physical evidence of her crime. The commanding officer informed me that she was being officially charged with felony breaking and entering, criminal trespassing, and felony property damage for intentionally smashing the window glass with the brick. Because she possessed absolutely no real legal standing, absolutely no real lease agreement, and exactly 0 legal proof of residency, the local police department did not have to play the usual incredibly slow civil dispute game that actual squatters abuse. She was not a protected tenant. She was just a highly arrogant, common burglar who managed to pick the absolute worst house on the absolute worst possible day at the absolute worst possible specific time to brazenly commit a felony. After the patrol car drove away with a screaming Brenda in the back, the tactical team spent the entire rest of the morning happily running their scheduled drills. They violently blew the heavy front door completely off its rusty hinges with a specialized, highly explosive breaching charge. They threw at least 5 more loud flashbangs into various bedrooms. They systematically and joyfully destroyed the awful smelling lime green shag carpet and tore huge holes in the peeling floral wallpaper. It was absolutely glorious to watch. Every single loud boom that violently echoed from that rotting wooden box felt exactly like a massive victory bell ringing triumphantly in my ears. Brenda, unsurprisingly, did not ever come back to our quiet neighborhood. Her pristine, giant white luxury vehicle was aggressively towed away by a very happy tow truck driver later that exact same afternoon. Because, of course, she had parked it highly illegally directly across the pedestrian sidewalk. I heard several weeks later through Gary and the highly efficient neighborhood watch gossip chain that she actually tried to sue the local police department for severe emotional distress and permanent hearing damage. The local judge apparently threw the ridiculous civil case out of court so incredibly fast it almost broke the sound barrier. She had absolutely zero legal case. You cannot intentionally break into a secured, privately owned property, commit felony trespassing, and then loudly complain to a judge when the police suddenly show up and treat you exactly like a dangerous intruder. It simply does not work that way in the real world, no matter how many incredibly stupid internet tutorial videos you watch on your phone. Exactly 2 weeks later, the police department entirely finished their tactical training program, and I happily hired a local demolition crew to completely flatten the ruined house with a bulldozer. It is just a flat, perfectly empty dirt lot now. I even planted some high-quality green grass seed over the dirt. It looks so much better than the old house ever did. Sometimes, when the evening wind blows just right through the trees, I swear I can still hear the very faint, ringing sound of a stun grenade detonating, immediately followed by the choking seagull shriek of a terrified squatter rapidly realizing she completely messed with the wrong regular guy. You absolutely know that highly specific feeling, right? When the massive, chaotic universe just miraculously aligns perfectly to hand swift, brutal karma directly to the exact person who genuinely deserves it the most. It is an incredibly rare, beautiful thing in this completely chaotic modern world. You cannot plan it perfectly, and you certainly cannot force it to happen. But man, when it actually happens right in front of your eyes, you just have to pull up a comfortable lawn chair, drink your dark roast coffee, and happily enjoy the absolute best show on earth.